Hello, I'm Khalil. The night my stepfather called my career filthy, my mother said nothing. My stepbrother sat there smirking, and I learned how easily a family can erase one son while lifting up the other. What none of them saw coming was this. The same work they looked down on would one day keep their business alive. And when they came back asking me for $100,000, I had to decide whether blood still meant loyalty or just debt. Before we get into it, tell me where you're listening from and what time it is where you are. Then stay with me, because what happened after that Easter dinner changed the way I saw my family forever. I was 18 when I walked into the Mercer house carrying my future in a paper folder so thin it almost felt embarrassing. A scholarship letter, a program packet, tuition estimates I had highlighted 3 different ways. I had gone over every number twice on the train home from the city, then once more in the driveway before I let myself open the front door. The kitchen looked the way it always did at that hour. Too clean, too bright. The counters shined under the pendant lights. My mother, Roni, stood at the sink with one hand in soapy water and the other on a dish towel. Sean sat at the island with invoices spread beside his glass, reading through them with the kind of concentration he reserved for money and nothing else. For one foolish second, the ordinary shape of the room calmed me. I remember setting the folder on the counter with more care than it deserved. "I got the scholarship packet," I said. "Not full tuition, but enough to make it possible if I work evenings." My mother turned halfway and smiled, the kind of smile that landed softly and disappeared fast. "That's nice, honey." I should have known then. In our house, "that's nice" usually meant no one intended to look any closer. Still, I kept going. I told them about the program, animal rehabilitation, premium care, recovery work, long-term treatment for pets after surgery, injury, or illness. I had done the research. I knew the demand was growing in Westchester and the city. I knew the work would be hard. I also knew I was good at it. Animals didn't care whether your last name impressed anyone. They only cared whether your hands were steady. I slid the scholarship letter closer to Sean. "I'm not asking you to carry all of it. I've got a plan." He didn't pick it up. He looked down once, just once, saw the title across the top page, and used 2 fingers to push the whole folder aside. Not hard, not dramatic, just enough to move it out of his space, as if the papers had brought a smell with them. "I'm not putting a cent into that," he said. I thought maybe I had heard him wrong. "Into what?" "That." He nodded toward the folder without looking at it again. "That line of work, bathing dogs, cleaning cages, all that mess. It's filthy, Khalil. I'm not paying for you to build a life around something like that." The room did not explode. No raised voices, no slammed hand. That almost made it worse. I looked at my mother. If she had said one sentence, even a weak one, I think I would have remembered that night differently. If she had said, "Sean, that's enough." If she had said, "Let him explain." If she had even picked up the folder and looked at it, I might have left that kitchen bruised instead of changed. Instead, the dish towel stopped in her hand. She lowered her eyes to the plate she was drying, then set it carefully on the rack. "Maybe this just isn't the best night for this conversation," she said quietly. That was it. Not defend him. Not "you're wrong." Not "my son deserves better than that." Just not tonight. Sean went back to his invoices. My mother went back to the sink. The overhead light buzzed faintly above us, loud enough now that I could hear it. The scholarship letter sat half crooked where he had shoved it, one corner bent against the granite. I stared at it longer than I should have. It hurt that Sean thought my future was beneath him. But I could have survived that. He was my stepfather. He had always treated respect like something that had to be earned in his language, on his terms. What settled somewhere deeper was my mother standing 3 feet away and choosing calm over me. That was the first time I understood how a person can be left alone without anybody actually leaving the room. I reached for the folder and straightened the bent corner with my thumb. My hands were steady. I was proud of that, even then. I didn't want Sean to hear my voice crack. I didn't want my mother to mistake restraint for agreement, but I also didn't want to give either of them the comfort of calling me immature. "All right," I said. Sean made a low sound like the matter had resolved itself the way sensible things always did. I tucked the scholarship packet under my arm and headed for the stairs. Halfway there, I stopped. Not because I had anything left to say to him, but because some part of me was still waiting for my mother to call my name. She didn't. I went upstairs with that folder in my hand and shut my bedroom door without making a sound. I did not lose money that night. I did not lose a place to sleep. What I lost was smaller, harder to explain, and far more expensive in the long run. I lost the belief that being prepared, serious, and decent would be enough to be respected in my own home. I kept telling myself that silence was not the same thing as rejection, and for years that lie was the only reason I kept showing up with something sweet in my hands. After that night, I got good at building a life no one in that house ever really saw. I worked early, studied late, and learned how to stretch every dollar until it nearly complained. My first apartment had walls thin enough to hear a neighbor cough through them, and a radiator that clanked like it had personal grudges. I took the train, cleaned kennels, assisted with recovery care, learned feeding schedules, medication charts, mobility work, skin checks, and the quiet discipline of handling frightened animals without adding my own nerves to theirs. Some evenings, dinner was a protein bar and coffee that had gone cold an hour earlier. My sneakers always smelled faintly of disinfectant and wet fur. I was tired most of the time, but I was moving towards something that felt honest. What I did not do was cut my family off. That would have made too much sense. Every Easter after that, every Thanksgiving, every birthday dinner when I knew my mother would be in that kitchen, I stopped at the same bakery and bought the same lemon cake she used to love. Not because it was remarkable, because it belonged to an earlier version of us, back when I still believed remembering what someone liked meant something. I would walk in carrying that white bakery box, and my mother would say, "Oh, that looks lovely," in the careful voice people use when they want credit for warmth without spending much of it. Then she would set it on the counter, sometimes by the fruit bowl, sometimes beside the refrigerator. Once right next to a tray Marcus had brought from some grocery store in town. His was unwrapped before I even sat down. Mine stayed closed until I left. That happened more than once. I noticed. Of course I noticed. But I kept making excuses for her because grown children can survive on maybe longer than they should. Maybe she was distracted. Maybe dinner ran late. Maybe she meant to serve it after coffee. Maybe the evening just got away from her. Maybe. The truth sat in that white box every holiday, untouched. The one person who never made me explain my work like I was defending a crime was Sherry Vale. She was my mother's aunt, though everybody called her Aunt Sherry, whether they were related to her or not. She lived in a small place in New Rochelle with faded curtains, a lamp that hummed if you turned it too far, and framed photographs on every flat surface she owned. Her apartment smelled like tea, old paper, and the dog biscuits she kept in a glass jar by the door for every animal in the building. One Thanksgiving after dinner at the Mercer house left me feeling like extra furniture. I drove her home because the weather had turned raw and windy. She invited me in for tea. I stayed because with Sherry, staying never felt like imposing. She asked me how work was going, and I told her, really told her. The recovery cases, the old shepherd with hip surgery, the terrier that bit everybody except me, the long hours, the small wins. The way some animals leaned into your hand after weeks of pain as if trust itself had weight. She listened the way people listen when they mean it. When I finished, she set down her cup and said, "There is nothing dirty about work that helps something living heal." I looked at her and laughed once, quietly. "You make it sound simple." "It is simple," she said. "Some people call care filthy because they've never had the courage to do any of it themselves." That sentence stayed with me. So did the way she said it, matter of fact, like she was naming the weather. Not flattering me, not rescuing me, just telling the truth plainly enough that I could stand inside it for a while. After that, whenever a holiday dinner at the Mercer house left me scraped raw, I thought about Sherry's apartment, the chipped mug in my hand, the dog-eared books on the side table, the little jar of treats by the door. She gave me just enough solid ground to keep me from turning hard too early. And that was the problem. Being seen clearly by one good person left just enough hope in me to keep misunderstanding everyone else. I told myself my mother was conflicted, not absent, pressured, not choosing. I told myself adulthood might soften her, that maybe one day she would look up from the sink, or the centerpiece, or the careful balance of that house and say, I know what it cost you to become who you are. So I kept going back. I kept bringing the cake. I kept watching her put it aside with that distracted little promise. We'll cut it later. One Christmas, I stayed long enough to help clear plates and carry serving bowls into the kitchen. The house was loud behind me, football on the television, Marcus laughing at something in the den, Sean talking over everybody as usual. I rinsed a platter, set it in the rack, dried my hands, and glanced toward the counter. The lemon cake was still there. Box closed, ribbon unbent, exactly where I had set it down 3 hours earlier. No knife beside it, no plates, no sign anyone had meant to open it at all. I stood there a second longer than I should have. Then I grabbed my coat, told my mother I was heading out, and waited for her to say something that might have made me stay. She kissed my cheek and said, "Drive safe, honey." That was all. On my way to the car, the cold air hit my face hard enough to wake me up. I sat behind the wheel, hands resting on the steering wheel, and heard Sherry's voice in my head as clearly as if she had been in the passenger seat. There is nothing dirty about work that helps something living heal. She could not heal that house for me. She could only keep me from believing I deserved what it kept doing. That was the problem with being seen clearly by even one good person. It left just enough hope in me to believe the rest of them might still come around if I gave them one more reason to. A little hope can make a grown man do expensive things. By then I was living in White Plains in a one-bedroom rental over a nail salon, close enough to the station that I could hear the late trains if I cracked the window. I had a folding desk by the wall, a second-hand sofa, and a kitchen small enough that I could turn from the sink to the stove without taking a full step. It was not much to look at, but every lamp, every chair, every bill on the counter had been paid for by work I could name with a straight face. That night I got home late, showered, answered 2 client emails, and was halfway through reheated takeout when my phone lit up with Sean's name. He never called just to talk. I let it ring twice, then a third time. By the fourth, I already knew it was not concern. It was Need wearing my stepfather's number. When I answered, his voice sounded lower than usual, tighter too. "Khalil, I need you to listen carefully. No hello, no how are you, straight to the cliff. Mercer Restoration Supply was in trouble. A payment had to clear by opening bell, or a supplier would freeze the account and flag the company with 2 contractor groups they relied on. One bad decision had turned into 3. Marcus had approved a purchase order that boxed them in, then a second one that assumed money was coming in faster than it was. Sean said it the way men like him always do when the truth embarrasses them. We had a breakdown on the operations side. I knew what that meant. "Marcus, how much?" I asked. There was a pause before he said it. $80,000. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the cabinet above the sink. My food had already gone cold. Now it looked ridiculous too, sitting there while a number that size hovered between my ear and the wall. "That isn't a bridge loan," I said. "That's life support." "I know what it is." "Then tell me exactly what happened." He gave me pieces. Vendor pressure, timing issues, temporary shortfall. Not one clean sentence that put blame where it belonged. I asked 3 more questions. He answered half of one. Then he changed direction, which was how I knew facts were no longer his real strategy. "This is family, Khalil." I almost laughed, but nothing about the moment felt funny. He kept going. "People are watching. If this business stumbles, everybody talks. You know how this county works. One bad morning, and folks start asking whether the Mercers are slipping." There it was, not truth, not apology, image. I should have stayed in the practical lane, asked for documents, a repayment plan, security, something adult and clean. Instead, I asked the question that had been sitting in my chest since I was 18. "If I do this," I said, "am I still family when it's over?" Silence met me first. Then Sean exhaled through his nose. "You always were," he said. "Don't turn this into something it isn't." It was a careful answer, not warm, not generous. Just enough. Enough to catch the part of me that still wanted one decent sentence from that man to mean more than it did. I did not sleep much. Around 6, I made coffee, opened my laptop, and sat at the folding desk by the window. The bank screen glowed back at me. $80,000 looked different in the morning. It looked like the van I wanted to buy for transport work. It looked like another set of treatment tables. It looked like breathing room I had earned the hard way. My coffee sat untouched while I typed in the transfer information. I knew better. That is the part people do not understand. I was not fooled because I was young. I was fooled because I was hopeful. And those are two very different things. I hit send, a spinning icon, a confirmation screen. Then nothing. A few minutes later, Sean texted, "Received. We'll talk soon." That was it. No call from my mother, no message saying she knew what I had done. No one said, "You saved us." No one said, "We won't forget this." The money disappeared into the company the same way rain disappears into dark soil. Gone from sight almost immediately. Useful only because something thirsty had been waiting for it. Months later, I was at a summer cookout in Scarsdale when I heard my stepfather clap Marcus on the shoulder in front of two cousins and say, "He really held things together this year." Marcus nodded like a man accepting credit he had already rehearsed receiving. "It's been a grind," he said, "but somebody had to step up." I stood there holding a paper plate and watched three people admire him for stability I had financed. My mother was beside the drinks table arranging napkins under a bowl of cut fruit. She heard it. I know she heard it. She did not look at me. She did not correct him. She just smiled in that thin, tired way and told one of the cousins Marcus had always had a head for business. That was when the pattern stopped being a series of separate wounds and became one continuous thing. Marcus stayed. Marcus got praised. Marcus got protected from the full cost of his mistakes. And I kept being useful in ways nobody named out loud. By the time I drove home that night, the Hudson Parkway dark on one side and the river black on the other, I understood something I had not wanted to put into words. The transfer had not bought me a place in that family. It had only postponed the moment I would have to admit I never had one. Still, some part of me held on. Not proudly, not intelligently, just stubbornly. I told myself Sean would remember when it mattered. My mother would remember. Somebody would say it when the time came. That was the trouble with sacrifice nobody acknowledged. Once people get used to benefiting from it in silence, they become very comfortable pretending you were never part of the rescue at all. By the time Easter came around, I should have known better than to mistake an invitation for inclusion. I drove to Scarsdale with a lemon cake on the passenger seat and a bottle of decent wine in the back, the same way I always did when I wanted to believe effort still counted for something. The street was already crowded when I pulled up. Cars lined both curbs, voices spilled from the open front door. Through the front window, I could see spring flowers on the table and more place settings than usual. That was the first thing that felt off. Too much silver, too many chairs, too much care. Inside, everything looked polished to the point of strain. The dining room had been staged the way people stage houses before an open listing. Fresh tulips. Better wine than my mother usually opened for family. A framed photo of Sean and Marcus by the sideboard, not even pretending to be random. Then I noticed the leather folder near Sean's plate. I set the cake on the kitchen counter. My mother turned, saw the box, and gave me that distracted smile I knew too well. "Oh, lemon. That's nice, honey. We'll put it out later." She slid it to the far end of the counter, near the coffee maker, where it sat beside a bowl of clementines and never quite belonged to the room. Marcus came in a minute later, wearing a pressed button-down and that easy confidence people confuse with competence when they've spent enough years protecting it. He greeted me like we were colleagues at a company mixer. "Glad you made it," he said. "Big day." Big day. Nobody explained that. Dinner started with the usual talk: property taxes, contractors, somebody's daughter at Syracuse, somebody else's knee surgery. I took my seat halfway down the table, far enough from Sean to notice the folder, close enough to hear every word. Marcus sat on Sean's right. My mother moved around filling glasses and smoothing place cards that did not need smoothing. People kept mentioning Marcus without seeming to notice they were doing it. He's really stepped up. Good head for business. Nice to see the next generation taking hold. I waited for someone to ask about my work, one of the new rehab contracts, the second location I was trying to secure. Anything. They didn't. I was there. I was dressed. I had brought dessert. And somehow I'd already been edited out before anyone raised a glass. Then Sean stood. He rested one hand on the back of his chair and lifted the other with his wine. The way men do when they've mistaken control for wisdom, for so long it becomes posture. The room quieted down. He talked about continuity, about family responsibility, about keeping what had been built in steady hands. Then he placed his fingers on the leather folder and nudged it toward Marcus. I think it's time, he said, to make clear what comes next. Marcus will be taking the lead at Mercer Restoration Supply, and when the time comes, the business and the family holdings will follow him. No one gasped. That was the worst part. A cousin nodded. Someone murmured that it made sense. One of Sean's friends actually said, "Good for him." Marcus put his hand on the folder before Sean had even finished speaking, then caught himself and smiled like he was trying not to appear too pleased. It did not work. I looked down the table toward my mother. She was smiling too, but not with joy. It was the face of a woman telling herself this was the neatest way through something ugly. I heard myself ask very evenly, "And where do I fit into any of this?" The room went still. That was her moment. My mother could have said I mattered. She could have said I had helped keep that company standing. She could have said this was not the way to do this. Instead, she looked down, adjusted the corner of a napkin by her plate, and said, "Khalil, please don't make tonight harder than it needs to be. You have your own life." I think that hurt more than Sean's speech, because Sean had never promised to be fair. My mother had never stopped pretending she might be. From the kitchen doorway, I could see the lemon cake box still sitting where she had left it, closed, untouched, waiting for a later that never came. That was when the whole room came into focus. Marcus at the center of it, Sean performing certainty, my mother choosing order over truth with one hand on a folded napkin, and me still expected to sit there quietly and let them call it family. Whatever I was about to say, it was not going to come from the part of me that had kept trying. I did not raise my voice. That surprised them more than anger would have. I looked around the table and let the silence sit there long enough to make everybody feel it. "I'm not asking for money," I said, "and I'm not asking for a share. I'm asking whether any of you are willing to say out loud what you've already decided." Nobody answered. A cousin lowered his eyes to his plate. One of Sean's friends reached for his glass and missed the stem the first time. Marcus leaned back in his chair like this was all a little beneath him, like my presence had become inconvenient instead of essential. My mother gave me that same careful expression she always used when she wanted a hard thing to pass quickly and quietly. "Sean saved them the trouble. If you had stayed with this family," he said, "if you had chosen something respectable instead of that filthy line of work, none of this would be a surprise. You walked away. Marcus didn't. There it was, clean, cold, deliberate. Marcus followed it with a shrug that made me want to laugh more than argue. You built your own life. Good for you. But you don't get to disappear and then act wounded when the rest of us move forward." Move forward. That was a nice phrase for a theft in daylight. My mother finally spoke, and even then it was not for me. "Let's not make a scene," she said softly. "This is Easter." That sentence told me everything I still needed to know. I could be humiliated in front of a room full of people, but what troubled her was the possibility that someone might have to feel uncomfortable about it. So I answered the only way left that still respected me. "The only thing filthy in this room," I said, "is the way you stand on work you were ashamed to name." That got their attention. I turned to Sean. "The business you're handing to Marcus tonight is standing because I wired $80,000 into it when you called me after midnight and said it might not survive until morning. That money came from the career you called filthy, from the work you looked down on, from the life you said was beneath this family." No one moved. I did not rush to fill the silence. I wanted it to reach every corner of that room. I looked at my mother next. "You knew." Her lips parted, but nothing came out. Then I looked at Marcus. "So when people tell you that you held the company together, do you ever feel tempted to correct them? Or have you heard it often enough that you believe it yourself?" He flushed just slightly. "That's not fair." "No," I said, "this isn't. Sean pushed his chair back a few inches. That money was family support. Don't turn around now and act like you bought something with it. I didn't buy anything, I said. That's the point. I gave it because I was still foolish enough to think being loyal mattered here. I picked up my napkin, set it beside the plate, and stood. If this is who I am to you, I said, if this is what my work is, if this is how easy it is to erase me while still using what I built, then don't call me son when it suits you. Don't call me family when the bills come due. Don't ask me to carry anything for this house again. Nobody tried to stop me. Not really. Some people shifted in their seats. Somebody said my name, but without conviction. My mother half rose, then sat back down. Sean stared at me like I had broken some unwritten rule by saying the quiet part first. Marcus looked angry, but also exposed, which suited him better. On my way out, I passed through the kitchen. The lemon cake was still where my mother had left it. White box, ribbon untouched. Hours gone, and nobody had even moved it closer to the plates. I stood there for half a breath and understood something that should have come to me sooner. The inheritance speech had not created the rejection. It had only put proper lighting on it. I left the cake, I walked out to my car, drove back to White Plains, and let the road do what roads sometimes do for grown men who are trying not to unravel. It gave me something to watch until I could get home without thinking too hard. That night, I put my keys on the kitchen counter, took off my jacket, and looked at my phone more times than I want to admit. Not for Sean, not for Marcus, for my mother. Nothing came. Not that night, not the next morning, not the day after. No message saying she should have spoken. No call explaining that Easter got out of hand. No attempt to soften what had been said across that table. The silence after it all was worse in one particular way. It proved none of them believed repair was necessary. That was when the last of the confusion started to drain out of me. What happened at Easter was not a misunderstanding. It was not a rough family moment. It was not something anyone regretted once the dishes were cleared. It was a decision. And once nobody called to make it right, I stopped wondering whether I had overreacted and started learning what a quiet life felt like when nobody expected me to crawl back first. For about 6 months, my life got smaller in all the right ways. I woke up when I wanted to. I made coffee in a quiet kitchen that belonged to me. I checked the schedule for the day, answered a message from Aaron about staffing, glanced over supply orders, and drove to work without rehearsing conversations in my head. No holiday obligations, no careful wording, no wondering whether my mother had finally decided to say something decent. That kind of peace is easy to miss if you have never lived without it. It is not dramatic. It is just the absence of being summoned. Some mornings I would stand at the counter with my mug in my hand and notice what was no longer there. No knot in my stomach before family dinners. No guilt waiting by the phone. No voice in my head telling me to be the easier son. I was not healed, but I was steadier. There is a difference. Then on a gray Saturday just after 7, my phone lit up with Sean's name. I let it ring once, twice. Then I answered. He did not ask how I was. He did not mention Easter. He did not even pretend. Marcus made a bad call, he said. A contract fell apart. If we don't come up with $100,000 by Monday, the whole company could go sideways. I leaned against the counter and stared out the window at the wet street below. That sounds serious. It is serious, he said sharply. This is the family business, Khalil. If word gets out, the Mercer name takes the hit. I almost admired the nerve of it. My name had been easy enough to bury, but now the family name was suddenly sacred again. You had no trouble leaving me out of that name when it suited you, I said. He ignored that. I'm asking you to help us protect what matters. What mattered? Not me, not what had been said at that table, not the years before it. Just the company, the reputation, the mess Marcus had made. I ended the call without agreeing to anything, but after I set the phone down, I stayed where I was for a while. Old habits do not die because they deserve to. They die because reality keeps embarrassing them. Some worn-out part of me still heard emergency and thought family before it thought manipulation. I told myself maybe that was the end of it. Maybe Sean had too much pride to show up in person. Maybe my mother would stop him. The next morning proved I still gave people too much credit. The doorbell started just after 8. Not one polite ring, 3 quick presses in a row, the kind that tells you the person outside believes your time belongs to them. When I opened the door, all 3 of them were standing there. Sean in a dark coat, jaw set. Marcus looking rumpled and tired in a way that was supposed to read as remorse. My mother clutching her handbag with both hands like she had been drafted into the scene against her will. I kept one hand on the inside of the door and did not invite them in. Roni spoke first. "Khalil, please, we just need a minute." "You already had one yesterday." Sean stepped forward half an inch. "This is bigger than hurt feelings." That line nearly made me smile. Men like Sean always call it hurt feelings when the damage is theirs. Marcus finally looked at me. "I know this looks bad." "It looks accurate," I said. My mother glanced past me into the apartment, the clean counters, the coat on the chair, the life she had never really asked about. Then she said the sentence I should have expected and still was not ready to hear. "You have enough," she said softly. "This would hurt him far more than it would hurt you." There it was. Not "I'm sorry," not "we were wrong," not "you have every reason to shut this door." Just the old math again. Khalil can survive it. Khalil will absorb it. Khalil has built enough, so take from him one more time. I looked at her for a long second. "Do you hear yourself?" Her eyes filled, but I had seen tears used as a buffer before. I was not cruel enough to enjoy them, and not foolish enough to trust them. Sean's voice hardened. "No one is asking you to like this. We're asking you to do the right thing." "The right thing?" I said. "You cut me out in public, called my work disgraceful, and now you're on my doorstep because Marcus wrecked something he was handed. That is not my emergency." Marcus lifted a hand. "I made a mistake." "Yes," I said, "and for once it gets to stay yours." My mother took a breath like she was preparing to say my name in a way that would pull me back toward her. It did not work. "I'm not your emergency fund," I said. "I'm not the cleanup crew for this family anymore. You need to leave." Sean stared at me, waiting for the old version of me to reappear. He didn't. After a moment, he said, "You'd really let your own family sink over this?" I kept my voice level. "You made it clear at Easter that I was not part of the family business. I'm simply respecting your decision." Then I opened the door a little wider, not to welcome them, but to make the exit easier to understand. "If you're still standing here in 30 seconds, I said, "I'll call the police." My mother flinched. Marcus looked insulted. Sean looked stunned that a boundary had finally turned into something with edges. They left. I shut the door, rested my forehead against it for one brief second, then walked back to the kitchen. My coffee had gone cold again. I poured it out, made a fresh cup, and told myself it was over. By noon the next day, my phone was lighting up for a different reason, and this time it was not my family asking for money. It was strangers asking what kind of son I really was. By lunchtime, the day after I shut the door on them, my phone looked like it belonged to somebody else. At first, it was only odd enough to be irritating. A missed call from a client who usually texted. A cancellation from an older woman in Rye who had trusted me with her lab after surgery. Then Aaron sent me a screenshot with one line under it. "You need to see this now." I opened it standing behind the front desk. Marcus had posted a long, self-pitying version of the story online. Not anywhere dramatic. That was what made it dangerous. Facebook, a couple of local community groups, one small business thread where contractors and shop owners traded recommendations. He wrote like a wounded son trying to protect his parents from disgrace. He said our family business was collapsing. He said I had more than enough to help and turned my back anyway. He said success had made me cold. He said some people forget where they came from. He never called me a liar. He never accused me of anything you could drag into court in one neat sentence. He did something worse. He made me legible to strangers as the kind of man people already know how to resent. The wealthy son, the ungrateful son, the one who lets his own mother cry while he counts his money. By 2 o'clock, it was no longer just insulting. It was expensive. 3 appointments canceled. 2 new inquiries disappeared after asking whether the family situation was going to affect operations. Our rating dipped under a cluster of 1-star reviews from people who had never walked through the door. One woman wrote, "I don't trust people who abandon their parents." Another said, if this is how he treats family, imagine how he treats your pets. That one made me put my phone down. Not because it was clever, because it worked exactly the way Marcus meant it to. He had reached into the one clean thing I had built and tried to smear it with the same shame my family used inside the house. Erin came out from the back room with her tablet in hand and her jaw tight. I've been reporting what I can, she said, but this is spreading faster than the removals. I nodded. How bad? She turned the screen toward me. Bad enough that Daisy Webb called asking whether she should postpone her retriever's rehab sessions until things settle down. That one landed. Daisy was 72, stubborn, generous, and the sort of client who brought Christmas tins for the whole staff. If somebody like Daisy had been shaken, Marcus had done more than post a grievance. He had infected trust. The rest of the afternoon moved in sharp little cuts. Another cancellation, a supplier asking whether we were still stable enough to move forward on revised terms. A young employee named Owen standing by the treatment room door, clearly trying not to interrupt, until he finally said, "Do you want us answering calls like normal? Or are we supposed to say something if people ask?" That question stayed with me longer than it should have. I told him, "Answer like normal. If someone asks directly, tell them our care hasn't changed." He nodded, but he did not move right away. "Can I ask you something?" "Go ahead." He shifted his weight. "If somebody says things about you that aren't true, are you supposed to keep your head down? Is that what people do when it's family?" There it was. Not from a lawyer. Not from some grand realization. From a kid in scrubs who looked about 23 and still believed adults knew the rules. For a second, I saw myself at that age, swallowing things so other people could stay comfortable, taking the hit, making excuses, calling it maturity because the alternative was admitting I had been trained to disappear. I said, "No, not when staying quiet lets the lie hurt everybody standing behind you." He gave one small nod and went back to work. That was the moment the whole thing changed shape for me. Until then, I had still been half inside the old trap. If I responded publicly, I would be the bitter son dragging family business into daylight. If I stayed silent, I could at least tell myself I had kept some shred of dignity. But that wasn't true anymore. Silence was no longer costing only me. It was costing Erin, Owen, Daisy, the clients who trusted us, and every person on payroll who depended on the place running clean. I went into my office, closed the door, and sat down without taking my coat off. For a few minutes, I did nothing. I just looked at the screenshots on my phone and let myself understand what Marcus had actually done. He was not lashing out because he was sorry. He was retaliating because being told no had humiliated him. Men like Marcus never confuse consequences with accountability. They confuse them with disrespect. And disrespect in their minds always deserves to be paid back. So I stopped asking whether they had gone too far. I started asking what they had left behind when they did. I took screenshots of every post, every comment, every cancellation, every review from an account with no client history. I saved timestamps, message threads, call logs, supplier emails. I made a list of lost appointments and another list of staff hours spent dealing with the fallout. By the time the sun dropped and the front windows turned dark, I had built the first clean outline of what had happened. Not a family argument, not a misunderstanding, damage. By the time I walked into Audrey Klein's office the next afternoon, I was carrying more than screenshots. I was carrying 14 years of proof that silence had never once protected me. Audrey Klein's office sat on the 6th floor of a brick building near the courthouse. All glass walls and gray carpet, and the kind of quiet that made people lower their voices, whether they meant to or not. I came in carrying a messenger bag heavy with printed screenshots, call logs, canceled bookings, supplier emails, review alerts, payroll notes, and the transfer record from the night I kept Mercer Restoration Supply from folding. Audrey did not ask me how I felt. She asked, "What can we prove?" That helped more than sympathy would have. We spread everything across her conference table. Marcus's posts, the timing of the cancellations, the one-star reviews from people who had never used us, messages from worried clients, notes from Erin about staff time lost handling the fallout. Then the older records, my wire transfer, Sean's late-night messages, dates, amounts, pieces that had looked separate until they sat together and started behaving like a pattern. Audrey tapped one page with her pen. This isn't family friction. This is reputational harm tied to a business loss. If they want to keep pretending this is private, let them. We don't have to. For the first time since Easter, I felt the fight leave the dining room. Then their side struck back. At the first formal exchange, Sean's attorney produced an old email chain and a voicemail clip. The email made it look as though I had linked my rescue transfer to a future claim on the company. The audio was worse. My own voice, trimmed down to a few clean lines, sounded calculating, bitter, like a man waiting to be paid in legacy if he could not be paid in cash. For one awful second, I was 18 again, standing in that kitchen with my future pushed aside by two fingers. That was what Sean had always understood best. If he could not beat the facts, he would drag everything back to character. He would make the question, not what happened, but who I was, a resentful son, a man keeping score, someone who helped only because he wanted a seat at the table. I could feel the old panic trying to rise, the old urge to explain myself, to say I had loved them, that I had meant well, that I never did any of it to bargain for a share. Audrey held up one hand without even looking at me. Don't argue intent from memory, she said quietly. Let's check the architecture. That sentence changed the room. She asked for the full email thread, not the printed excerpt, the metadata, not the screenshot, the original voicemail file, not the clipped audio. What came back told its own story. The email they submitted started in the middle. The message before it, missing from their copy, showed Sean assuring me that helping the company would not change my place in the family. The voicemail had been cut just before the point where I asked whether I would finally be treated like I belonged if I stepped in again. Then Audrey found the part that broke them open. Buried in a second production was an internal Mercer exchange dated 2 weeks before my transfer. Marcus had written that Sean needed to get through this quarter and that long-term we keep succession clean. Sean answered, agreed. No mixed expectations. No mixed expectations. They had already decided what I would not be before they took my money anyway. Audrey sat back in her chair and looked across the table at their counsel. So just to be clear, she said, calm as winter, your clients accepted emergency funds from Mr. Mercer, privately reassured him about his standing, later excluded him publicly, and are now submitting edited material to imply he acted in bad faith. That is not a family misunderstanding. That is a pattern. Nobody said much after that. They didn't need to. Sean's attorney went still in the way good lawyers do when the ground has changed under their shoes. Marcus looked less angry than confused, as if consequences had arrived speaking a language he had never expected to hear. Sean kept his face set, but he stopped trying to smooth anything over. For the first time in my life, his certainty looked expensive. That was the moment I understood the last lesson in all of it. I did not need to prove I had been pure. I only needed to prove they had known exactly what they were doing. Once the file spoke, my voice barely mattered. The rescue transfer, the inheritance dinner, the smear campaign, the edited records, all of it pointed in one direction. Use me in private, erase me in public, attack my livelihood when I refused to keep serving. When the meeting ended, Audrey gathered the documents into neat stacks and said, "They pushed too far. That usually helps." I walked out of the building into the late afternoon light with no urge to celebrate. I was not happy. I was not healed. But I was done begging the truth to sound kinder than it was. By then, the battle itself was mostly over. What remained was the part no judge could rule on. The legal part ended the way Audrey said it would. Quietly on paper, with numbers that finally meant something to people like Sean and Marcus. They paid. Not gracefully, not without grumbling, and not without trying to act like they had been cornered by technicalities instead of their own choices. But they paid. Marcus lost more than pride. Accounts were drained. A vehicle got sold. Sean had to restructure pieces of the business he had once spoken about like a family crown. For the first time in my life, the truth cost them something measurable. It did not make me happy. It made me tired. Back at the clinic, things settled slowly. Not all at once. Daisy Webb came in with her retriever one Tuesday morning and set a tin of shortbread on the counter for the staff like she always did. Before she walked back to the treatment area, she squeezed my forearm and said, "I'm glad folks finally got the whole story." That was all. It was enough. Aaron kept the place moving. Owen stopped looking over his shoulder every time the phone rang. Reviews steadied. Appointments filled back in. The air cleared. The work was still the work. Dogs recovering. Cats needing patience. Owners needing reassurance. Honest things, the kind that ask something from your hands and your character, not your last name. A few weeks later, my mother called. Not crying, not dramatic, just quieter than I had ever heard her. She asked if she and Sean could meet me for coffee. I almost said no. Instead, I gave them 20 minutes on a Thursday afternoon at a small place off Mamaroneck Avenue, mostly because I was done being afraid of rooms with them in it. They looked older when I walked in. That sounds cruel, but it isn't. Some truths age people fast. Sean's shoulders had dropped. My mother held her cup with both hands, like she needed help keeping it steady. No wine glasses, no holiday china, no audience. Just the three of us in a window looking out on a damp parking lot. Sean started with business language even then. Things have been difficult. I let that sit there. My mother tried again. We're under pressure, Khalil. There it was. Not we were wrong. Not we failed you. Pressure, as if life had simply rolled over them by accident. I saved us all some time. What do you need? My mother looked down. Sean answered. The house was in trouble. Bills had stacked up. Marcus was gone more than he was around. They needed help getting through the next stretch. Not the business this time. Themselves. I studied them for a moment and realized what made the scene hard. They were not monsters in that coffee shop. They were two worn-out people who had spent years making terrible moral choices in ordinary voices. That is always harder to refuse than a villain. My mother finally said, I know I should have said more. Back then, I know that. It was the closest she had ever come. I nodded once. You should have. She swallowed and looked at me with the same face she used to wear when I brought that cake through the front door, as if she wanted warmth without having to earn it. And that was when the whole thing came back to me in one simple image. That lemon cake, I said. She blinked. What? I brought it for years. Every holiday. Same bakery. Same box. You always said you'd put it out later. Neither of them spoke. I kept my voice level. You never opened it. I should have learned from that sooner. My mother's eyes filled. I did not press. I did not need to. That one sentence carried enough history on its own. Then I stood. Sean looked up at me. So that's it? I picked up my coat from the back of the chair. If you need saving, I said, ask your heir. I left before either of them could shape that into something softer. Outside, the air was cold and clean. I walked back to my car, drove to the clinic, and got there just before closing. Aaron was at the desk finishing the last calls. A beagle in recovery started thumping his tail against the kennel door when he saw me. I unlocked my office and set my keys on the desk and stood there for a second listening to the ordinary sounds of the place I had built. Phones, footsteps, a dog barking once, a drawer closing in the treatment room. That was my life. Not untouched, not painless, but mine. There is no next chapter in that house for me, only the one I finally wrote without them. And for the first time in my life, that felt like enough.